Hi everybody, my name is Yarrow Koning and I am the Community Leadership Development Program Manager at Global Growers Network. And today we're going to be talking about birds, bees, and butterflies, how to support pollinators in your garden. I know you all have been learning some about pollinator gardens through your Youth Food Justice internship, so I hope that this class will be a nice addition to your learning. And if you have any questions, please feel free to give them to Lauren and she'll send them to me and I'll get them answered for you. Okay, here we go. Okay, so what is pollination? I know some of y'all may have learned this in your science classes already, but let's talk about it for a quick review. So pollination is really important to plant reproduction. It is the process by which pollen moves from the male anther of a plant to the female stigma of a plant. And so there's different kinds of pollination that can happen. Some plants are self-pollinating, which means that the pollen moves between different flowers on the same plant or even within the same flower. And some plants require cross-pollination, which means that the pollen moves between flowers that are on different plants. Who are pollinators? So pollinators is basically anyone, or as you'll see, anything that helps move pollen. So here's this great poster of different pollinators. You can see all kinds of animals on here. You can see a bat, you can see little reptiles and amphibians, you can see a flying squirrel on there. All of these animals are involved in pollination. Additionally, wind and water can move pollen, but it's not a very effective way to move pollen for a lot of plants. Over 75% of flowering plants in the entire world require animals to help with pollination. Even humans are included in that. So humans can pollinate, for example, corn. When corn is grown in a small area, a lot of times humans will help pollinate by hand. Most of the pollinators in the world are insects. These include bees, wasps, flies, butterflies, moths, and beetles. For this class today, we're going to talk specifically about how to support birds, bees, and butterflies in your gardens. So why do pollinators matter? If there weren't any pollinators, it would mean no plants or a lot fewer plants, and that would mean no food for us. Pollination is really important for plants to form seeds and to be able to reproduce, also to produce fruit. You can see over 85% of the world's flowering species and 2/3 of all crops, so fruits and vegetables and grains, need pollinators to reproduce. If there weren't any pollinators, there would also be less food for wildlife. So pollinators are really important to the entire ecosystem. They support animals, they support humans, they're very important. And also, they're important for beauty. Flowers are so pretty in part because they're trying to attract different pollinators. So what's in it for the pollinators? Why do pollinators bother to do this? Well, for one thing, flowers are a really important source of food for a lot of pollinators. They'll eat the nectar or sometimes even the pollen. Flowers also are really important to mating for a lot of pollinating insects. So some insects will use the oils on flowers as a perfume to try and attract other insects. Or it'll be an important spot for dates, so to meet other potential mates. It's a really important spot to rest. So you can see that picture on the right there. Some bees are taking a nap in a flower. And it's also a really important spot to lay eggs. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. So one reason it's really important to support pollinators in your gardens is that pollinators are actually at risk right now. A lot of species are in decline due to some pretty significant threats. First, you can see on the top left there, habitat loss. That's the biggest threat to pollinators. So that means there are less places for pollinators to live, there's less sources of food for them. It's any sort of negative impacts on where pollinators live. On the top right, you'll see pesticides. That's another really big problem. As you all probably have learned in your internship, a lot of commercial farms use a lot of pesticides to produce food. These pesticides can kill insects that cause problems, but they also kill pollinators. On the bottom left, you can see urban development. So cities can really be a problem for pollinators because they require moving so much vegetation that pollinators need to survive. And then we have diseases. There are some diseases, sometimes we know the cause of them, sometimes we don't, but they can really cause a real threat to pollinators. There's actually a big disease called colony collapse disorder that is really impacting especially honeybee populations in the United States. And then climate change. We don't know exactly how climate change is going to impact pollinators, but we expect that it's going to have some negative impacts on pollinating insects. So let's talk about bees. Bees are really important pollinators because they only feed on flowers. Bees and flowers have actually evolved together. So some flowers over time have changed their patterns in ways to attract bees in specific. We'll talk about how bees see in the next slide. There are over 4,000 native bee species in North America. So there are a lot of bee species and they're doing a lot of pollination work. Some bee species only visit one type of flower, which means they'll be really important for that particular type of flower. That flower will depend on bees to reproduce. And European honeybees are actually not native to the United States, so we're not going to talk about them in this class, although there's a lot to be learned about European honeybees. So here's an interesting slide about how bees and humans see. So bees can see ultraviolet colors, so those colors kind of towards the right. You can see the line really extends farther right, but they cannot see the color red. So bees can't really see red flowers. If you're planting a lot of red flowers, you're not going to attract bees specifically. Bees really prefer flowers that have really strong smells, as well as blue, white, purple, orange, and ultraviolet colors. All right, let's talk about butterflies. Everybody loves butterflies, right? Really beautiful, really, really beautiful. So Georgia is home to 160 different butterfly species. And actually, if you put some work into it, almost any backyard can attract 30 unique butterfly species. Most butterflies feed on nectar from many different plants, but they'll require specific plants to reproduce. And a lot of those plants are plants that are native to Georgia. Okay, so finally, let's talk about birds, and I'm going to focus here on hummingbirds because birds can be its own class. Hummingbirds are really interesting because they, like the monarchs, also migrate. So they're moving pollen across great distances. This is really important because for plants to be healthy, they need to have genetic diversity. So hummingbirds will provide this important link between plants all over the country and down into Mexico and Central America and help keep the population of species very diverse. In Georgia, there's only one species that breeds here or has its babies here, and that is the ruby-throated hummingbird. If you put out hummingbird feeders, you will see this species. I have a ton of them in my yard, and I can tell you that they will defend their feeding areas. They're very aggressive. If a hummingbird moves into your area and loves your feeder, they'll scare off other birds, including other hummingbirds, to protect their feeding source. One of the reasons they do this is because hummingbirds are so small and their metabolism is so fast that they need to eat many, many, many times a day. They need lots of nectar and lots of insects just to stay alive. Hummingbirds really like red flowers, so unlike bees who can't see red, hummingbirds are really attracted to red flowers, but they will feed on anything that has lots of nectar. And you can see in that bottom right how small their nests are. They build these tiny, tiny little nests on branches. And they're really adorable. Okay, so for the last part of this presentation, I'm going to talk to you about how to plant really beautiful pollinator gardens that will support lots of different pollinators. So diversity is really a big factor with a successful pollinator garden. So you're trying to attract lots of different species of pollinators, and these pollinators will like different plants. So you need to choose plants that have different shapes, sizes, heights, colors, patterns, and smells to attract all these different kinds of insects and birds. Choose plants that bloom across 3 seasons, spring, summer, and fall. So you don't want to just give your pollinators food during one season, right? You want to be able to support them throughout the year. So if you choose plants that bloom at different times of year, they'll have a buffet of food all year round. One example is that in our pollinator garden at Decatur Kitchen Garden, we grow a lot of goldenrod, which is a really great source of food in the fall for pollinators, especially bees and butterflies. You also want to include nesting sites, so places where pollinators can nest and have their babies. Some good examples of that for different kinds of pollinators are bare ground, sunny bare ground. There are certain types of ground nesting bees that will only nest in the bare ground. Fallen logs are really good for pollinators that like to nest in cavities or in little holes in the logs. You can provide bird houses for birds, obviously, etc. Use native plants whenever possible. So like I mentioned earlier, a lot of pollinating insects have evolved with specific plants. So these plants provide specific sources of food for specific pollinators that live in Georgia. They're also a lot easier to grow. A lot of native plants are used to the weather in Georgia. They're used to diseases and pests, so they're more resistant to it, and you won't have to work as hard for them to succeed. One principle to keep in mind when you're designing any garden is right plant, right place. So make sure you know what your plant needs so you can put it in a place that's right for it, where it's going to be able to survive and to thrive. At the bottom here, I included a couple places where you can buy pollinator plants. The Georgia Native Plant Society, they do plant sales. Beach Hollow Wildflower Farm, they're in Athens, Georgia, but they do sales in Atlanta every year. And So True Seed, if you want to try and grow plants from seed, they're a great place to buy seed. Avoid harmful chemicals. So don't spray pesticides in or near pollinator gardens. Those pesticides are not just going to wipe out pests you wanna wipe out. They're going to wipe out pollinating insects as well. Do not use non-organic chemicals. Look for the OMRI label or the OMRI label. You can see that on the bottom right. That is a label that marks products that are certified for organic use in agriculture. If you must use pesticides, be extremely careful. Even organic pesticides can hurt pollinators. There's one particular type of pesticide called BT. You can see it there on the bottom left. It's in things like caterpillar killers. So that'll kill caterpillars that will eat your vegetables, but it'll also kill pretty much any caterpillar, including caterpillars for butterflies that you really want to keep around. And do not buy plants grown with neonicotinoids. So a lot of the plants that you buy at Home Depot will have neonicotinoids in it, which is this chemical that is meant to make your seedling more resistant to diseases, but can also really hurt native bee species. Buy organic plants and seeds whenever possible. Provide winter shelter. So pollinators that don't migrate, they really need a place to hide from the cold in the winter. And a lot of times when people will clean up their gardens for the winter, they'll just remove everything, or they'll rake up all the leaves in their yard, they'll get rid of all vegetation, and that's really bad for pollinators because then they don't have anywhere to go. So you can leave some leaf litter around, like don't rake up all of your leaves, maybe leave a spot that has some leaves in it, leave a few fallen logs or twigs and sticks. If you have pollinator plants, wait to cut them back until the spring, because a lot of pollinators will hide out in the stems. They'll just sleep in the stems. You can see that picture on the top right. They've kind of left that debris there through the winter. You can build special things like bee blocks or bee hotels where bees can hibernate. You can leave areas of untilled and uncultivated soil for ground hibernating pollinators. So some pollinators need to go in the soil. If you leave some areas for them to do that, that's great. And consider only working the top 6 inches of your soil so they can go a little bit deeper and hide out for the winter and be fine. For this last slide here, I've included a couple other wildlife garden ideas. I think it's always really great to support wildlife in your gardens if you can. So in the top left there is something called a toad abode. It's a little house that somebody's made for frogs and toads to live in. A stacked wall can be a really good habitat for reptiles and amphibians, so lizards, geckos, things like that. They can live in between the stone and they look really pretty. On the top right is a bat box. You can install that to support bats, and bats will eat a lot of mosquitoes, so they're also helpful to you. And bats are also threatened species, so they're a good population to support. On the bottom left, you can see a little dish of water somebody's put out in their pollinator garden. All you need is a little shallow dish, put a few rocks in it so the butterflies can sit on the rocks, and then there's a great source of water for your pollinators. That's really cheap and easy to make. We've got our log piles, we've already talked about that. And then on the right is a hummingbird feeder. So you can plant native species to support hummingbirds, and that's probably the best thing to do. But as a supplement, since they have to eat so much, you can put out a hummingbird feeder. And I am happy to answer any questions folks have about hummingbird feeders because I have one in my yard. I actually have 3 in my yard. Here I've included a bunch of resources. I know since this is a video, you can't click on it, but I'll make sure I send all these links to Lauren to share with you. And yeah, this is a lot of different resources, places that you can buy native plants, as well as places like the Xerxes Society. They are really experts in pollinating insects. You can learn so much from them. Resources like the Native Plant Finder and the Georgia Butterfly Association. Those websites will tell you plants that you can grow in Georgia to support specific types of pollinators. And again, I work with global growers. You can visit our website at www.globalgrowers.org to learn more about what we do and how we support people from diverse cultures who grow fresh food for their families and local marketplaces. Thank you.